On New York's most expensive sidewalk, a teenager in worn-out uniform ran towards the fallen baby. When the millionaire mother started screaming for security, he trembled, but what the cameras recorded in that moment would change everyone's lives forever. Mike's alarm buzzed at 4:45 a.m., its harsh sound cutting through the darkness of the tiny Bronx apartment. His hand shot out from under the thin blanket, smacking the plastic clock before it could wake his grandmother in the next room. The springs of his old mattress creaked as he sat up, his feet hitting the cold floor. Another day, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. The apartment was dead quiet except for his grandmother's soft snoring through the thin walls. He grabbed his worn uniform from the chair where he'd laid it out the night before, a blue button-up shirt with a small tear in the collar and khaki pants that were slightly too short at the ankles. His growth spurt hadn't been kind to his wardrobe. In the bathroom, Mike splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, making him look older than 13. His short-cropped hair needed a trim, but that would have to wait until he saved up enough from his weekend paper route. The kitchen was small but spotlessly clean. Mike moved quietly, making himself a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. His stomach growled, but breakfast would have to wait until he got to school. The free meal program was one of the few perks of his long commute. As he packed his weathered backpack, his eyes landed on the pile of bills on the kitchen counter. Medical statements with red "past due" stamps peeked out from beneath utility notices. His grandmother's arthritis medication wasn't covered by insurance, and the costs were mounting. "Michael?" His grandmother's voice called softly from her room. "That you up already, baby?" "Yeah, Gran. Go back to sleep. I'm just heading out. Be careful out there. Text me when you get to school." "I will. Love you, Gran. Love you too, baby." The pre-dawn air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside their building. The street was quiet, with only a few other early risers waiting at the bus stop. Mike pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders and started walking toward the subway station. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed overhead as he swiped his student Metro card. The platform was sparse, mostly cleaners, security guards, and other students making long commutes to better schools in different districts. As Mike waited for the train, his mind drifted to 6 years ago. He'd been 7, sitting on this same platform with his mom. She'd been dressed up, promising she was just going to a job interview. "Wait right here, baby. Mama will be right back." He'd waited for hours until a police officer finally found him and called his grandmother. The screech of the arriving train jerked him back to the present. He boarded quickly, finding a seat near the door. The car smelled of coffee and cleaning solution. An elderly janitor nodded at him. They saw each other most mornings but had never spoken. The 2-hour ride passed in a blur of stations and faces. Mike tried to review his math homework, but the numbers swam before his tired eyes. His grades had been slipping lately. Between the long commute and his weekend job, he barely had time to study. As the train emerged above ground, the Manhattan skyline came into view. Glass towers stretched toward the clouds, their windows reflecting the rising sun. Mike watched the city change around him. Graffiti giving way to designer stores, small apartments replaced by doorman buildings. The Upper East Side station was a different world. Marble floors gleamed under bright lights. Well-dressed commuters rushed past with expensive coffee cups and designer bags. Mike kept his head down as he climbed the stairs to the street. "Hey, watch it." A man in a suit snapped as Mike accidentally brushed against his briefcase. "Sorry, sir," Mike mumbled, stepping aside. The sidewalks were starting to fill with people heading to work. Women in high heels clicked past. Men spoke rapidly into Bluetooth earpieces. Private school kids in crisp uniforms waited for their drivers. Mike passed the same security guard he saw every morning outside the Bristol Tower. The guard's eyes followed him suspiciously, hand resting on his radio. Mike quickened his pace slightly. "Morning, kid," called Mr. Chun from his newspaper stand. He was one of the few friendly faces Mike encountered on this stretch. "Morning, Mr. Chun." Mike managed a small smile. "Here, take this." Mr. Chun held out an apple. "You look tired today." "Thanks, but I can't dash. Take it. My wife packed too much lunch anyway." Mike accepted the apple gratefully, tucking it into his backpack. "I'll pay you back tomorrow." Mr. Chun waved him off. "Just stay in school, kid. That's payment enough." As Mike continued down the street, The morning traffic grew heavier. Luxury cars idled at stoplights. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb ahead of him, and a woman in a cream-colored dress stepped out, struggling with shopping bags and a phone pressed to her ear. "No, I need those contracts reviewed by noon," she was saying sharply. A baby carrier dangled from her arm, a small boy strapped inside, maybe 8 or 9 months old. Mike's pace slowed as he watched her juggling her things. The baby was crying, but she seemed too distracted to notice. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, and the air felt heavy with coming rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Mike glanced at his watch. He still had 20 minutes before first period. The woman was still arguing on her phone, setting her shopping bags on the sidewalk. The baby's cries grew louder. A few drops of rain began to fall, speckling the concrete. The woman cursed under her breath, trying to gather her bags while keeping the phone pressed to her ear. The baby carrier swung precariously as she moved. "Look, just get it done," she snapped into the phone. "I don't care what it takes." Mike hesitated, watching the scene unfold. More people hurried past, heads down against the gathering storm. The first real drops of rain began to fall. The woman finally noticed her crying son. "Should Jacob, please," she said distractedly. "Mommy's working." The sky opened up suddenly, rain pouring down in sheets. People ran for cover, opening umbrellas or ducking into doorways. The woman grabbed her bags, still talking rapidly on the phone. And that's when Mike saw it. The baby carrier wasn't properly secured. As the woman turned to avoid a puddle, the carrier began to tip. Time seemed to slow down. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He could stay back, remain invisible like he always did. Or he could act. The carrier tilted further. The baby's cries turned to screams. The woman, focused on her call, hadn't noticed. Mike's feet were moving before his brain could catch up. The rain soaked through his uniform as he sprinted forward. Cars honked as he pushed through the crowd. The carrier was falling. The baby was falling. And Mike was running straight toward them both. Rain pelted Mike's face as he watched the woman juggle her phone and shopping bags. Her cream-colored dress was already soaked, clinging to her legs as she paced back and forth on the sidewalk. The baby's cries grew more insistent. "I said noon, not end of day," she barked into her phone. "The client won't wait." Mike stood frozen, water dripping from his uniform. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head from their conversation last night. "Your medicine," he'd said, holding the pharmacy bill. "It's gone up again. Don't you worry about that." Her hands had trembled as she stirred their dinner. "I've got some savings." But Grandash Michael James Walker. She turned to face him, her eyes stern but tired. "You focus on school. That's your job right now." Thunder cracked overhead, yanking Mike back to the present. The woman was now arguing with someone else on the phone. "No. Tell David the meeting can't be moved." She shifted her weight, the baby carrier swinging. "I don't care about his golf game." The baby, Jacob, she called him, was red-faced from crying. His tiny fists waved in the air, straining against the carrier's straps. A gust of wind whipped down the street, sending the woman's shopping bags skittering across the wet sidewalk. "Damn it!" She lunged for them, phone still pressed to her ear. Mike saw the exact moment it happened. The carrier's handle, slick with rain, slipped from her grip. It seemed to hang in the air for a split second before starting to fall. His body moved on pure instinct. The wet concrete slapped against his shoes as he sprinted forward. Cars blared their horns as he darted between them. "Hey!" someone shouted. "Watch it, kid!" The carrier was tipping toward the street. A taxi was approaching, its yellow bulk vivid against the gray rain. The driver hadn't seen the danger yet. Mike's lungs burned. His backpack slapped against his spine with each step. He was almost there. The woman finally noticed. Her phone clattered to the sidewalk as she reached for the carrier, but she was too far away. "Jacob!" Her scream cut through the rain. Mike launched himself forward, just as the carrier broke free completely. His hands found the handle, but the momentum was too strong. Both he and the carrier went down. He twisted his body, taking the impact on his shoulder. Pain shot through his arm as he hit the ground. The carrier landed on top of him, the baby wailing but secure. "Get away from him." The woman's voice was shrill with panic. "Someone call security." Mike tried to sit up, still holding the carrier steady. "Ma'am, I was just Dash." Don't touch my son. She snatched the carrier away, backing up. Her eyes were wild with fear and anger. People were stopping now, phones out, recording. Mike could hear their whispers. Did you see that? What was he trying to do? Someone called the police. A security guard from one of the buildings jogged over, radio in hand. Is there a problem here? This boy Dash, the woman's voice shook. He grabbed my baby's carrier. I was helping, Mike said, his voice barely audible over the rain. It was falling. Dash, step back from the lady, kid. The guard's hand moved to his belt. Now! Mike's shoulder throbbed as he got to his feet. His uniform was soaked and dirty, knees scraped raw through his pants. More people were gathering despite the rain. A man in a business suit was already on the phone with police. Two women hurried to the mother's side, shooting suspicious glances at Mike. Are you okay? One asked her. Should we call someone? The woman clutched her baby carrier close, hands shaking. I can't believe he just came out of nowhere. Dash, Mike's stomach churned. He thought of his grandmother. How worried she'd be when she found out about this. How disappointed. The security guard stepped between Mike and the woman. Stay right there, kid. Police are on their way. The rain was still falling, but Mike barely felt it now. His heart pounded in his ears. The growing crowd formed a loose circle around him, their phones recording every moment. He could run. The thought flashed through his mind. Just turn and sprint back to the subway, disappear into the city. But that would only make him look guilty. The baby had stopped crying. At least, Mike could see him through the carrier's rain cover, eyes wide but calm. My son could have been hurt, the woman was saying to anyone who would listen. In broad daylight, right here on Park Avenue. Ma'am, Mike tried again, his voice steadier. The carrier was falling. I was trying to dash. Don't speak to me. She cut him off. Just stay away from us. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Mike's phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably the school wondering why he wasn't in first period. The security guard's radio crackled. NYPD is 1 minute out. Hold the suspect. Suspect. The word hit Mike like a physical blow. Is that what he was now? He thought of his father, who'd left before Mike could even remember him. Had he ever been in a situation like this? Standing in the rain, surrounded by accusatory stares? The police cars pulled up, lights flashing blue and red against the wet buildings. Two officers stepped out, hands on their belts. That's him, the security guard said, pointing at Mike. The kid in the school uniform. Mike's legs felt weak. His shoulders screamed in pain. But he stood straight, hands visible at his sides, just like his grandmother had taught him. Keep your hands where we can see them, son, one officer called out. Don't move. The crowd parted as the officers approached. Mike could hear phones clicking, recording every moment. Tomorrow, his face would probably be all over social media. The woman was talking rapidly to the second officer, gesturing wildly with her free hand. The baby carrier was clutched tight against her chest. He just rushed at us, she was saying. I didn't see where he came from. Mike closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the rain on his face. He thought of his grandmother's medication, the bills piling up at home. He thought of her face when she found out about this. I'm sorry, Gran, he whispered. The first officer reached him, hand on his holster. Put your hands on your head, kid. Nice and slow. Mike complied. Rain running down his arms, his school backpack lay forgotten on the wet sidewalk, papers probably soaked through. We're going to need you to come with us, the officer said. Turn around slowly. As Mike turned, he caught a glimpse of Mr. Chun at his newspaper stand, watching with concern. The old man took a step forward, then stopped, shaking his head sadly. The cold metal of handcuffs pressed against Mike's wrists. The crowd's phones followed his every move, documenting what was quickly becoming the worst day of his life. You have the right to remain silent, the officer began. Anything you say can and will be used against you. The words washed over Mike like the rain. In the distance, he could still hear the baby's mother talking, her voice rising with each word. I want to press charges. He could have kidnapped my son. The handcuffs clicked shut, and Mike Walker, 13 years old, honor roll student, and now a parent criminal, was led to the waiting police car. Time stretched like cold molasses as Mike watched the baby carrier begin its fatal tilt toward the busy street. The world around him seemed to slow down, each raindrop hanging suspended in the air for a fraction of a second before continuing its descent. His feet pounded against the wet concrete, sneakers slipping slightly with each step. The distance between him and the falling carrier felt impossibly long. Cars blurred past on his left, their horns creating a cacophony of warning. "Watch out!" someone screamed from the sidewalk. Mike's lungs burned as he pushed himself faster. The baby's cries pierced through the ambient noise of traffic and rain. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The carrier was almost horizontal now, the baby's safety straps the only thing keeping the infant from spilling onto the street. The mother's cream-colored dress swirled in Mike's peripheral vision as she reached out, too far away to make a difference. 5 feet. Mike launched himself forward, arms outstretched. His shoulders screamed in protest as he twisted his body to take the impact. The carrier's handle was slick with rain, but his fingers found purchase. The momentum carried them both down. Mike felt his uniform shirt tear as he skidded across the rough concrete. Pain exploded in his knee, then his hip, then his shoulder. But his arms remained locked around the carrier, holding it secure against his chest. A taxi's tires screeched nearby, the vehicle swerving to avoid them. The driver leaned on his horn, the sound deafening at such close range. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the rain. "Get your hands off my son!" The mother's scream cut through everything else. Mike tried to sit up, still cradling the carrier to protect it from the wet ground. The baby had stopped crying, looking up at him with wide, startled eyes. "Ma'am, please," Mike started to say. The carrier was dash security. "Someone call security." Her voice was hysteric now. She lunged forward, yanking the carrier from Mike's grasp. "Don't you touch him. Don't you dare touch him." Mike's shoulders slumped as he remained on the ground, rain soaking through his already drenched uniform. His knee throbbed where it had hit the concrete. A small tear in his pants revealed scraped, bleeding skin underneath. People were gathering now, forming a tight circle around the scene. The click of phone cameras mixed with the falling rain. Voices murmured, growing louder with each passing second. "Did you see what happened? That boy just grabbed the baby. Someone call the police." Right here on Park Avenue. Can you believe it? A security guard pushed through the crowd, his black uniform stark against the sea of business attire. His hand rested on his belt as he assessed the situation. "Step away from the lady," he ordered Mike, voice hard. "Hands where I can see them." Mike slowly raised his hands, palms out. Water dripped from his fingertips. "Sir, I was trying to help. The carrier was falling dash. He tried to take my baby." The mother cut him off, backing away with the carrier clutched to her chest. Her designer dress was ruined, mascara running down her cheeks. He came out of nowhere and grabbed Jacob's carrier. The security guard's radio crackled. "This is Bristol Tower Security. We need NYPD at 667 Park Avenue. Possible attempted kidnapping in progress." Mike's stomach dropped. Kidnapping? The word echoed in his head, heavy with implications. More people were stopping now, despite the rain. Business people with umbrellas. Nannies with strollers. Private school kids in uniforms that looked so much nicer than his torn, wet one. All of them had their phones out. All of them were recording. "Stay right there, kid." The security guard's voice left no room for argument. "Police are on their way." Mike could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. His knee stung where the concrete had torn his skin. Water ran down his face, and he couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. The baby was still quiet, watching the scene unfold with curious eyes. His mother bounced the carrier gently, whispering soothing words while shooting glares in Mike's direction. "I can't believe this," she was saying to another woman who'd stopped to comfort her. In broad daylight, right here in Upper East Side, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Mike thought of his grandmother, of how worried she'd be when he didn't text her that he'd arrived at school. Would the police let him make a phone call? Would she have to come down to the station? The first police car pulled up, lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, hands already on their weapons. "That's him," the security guard said, pointing at Mike. The kid in the torn uniform. Mike's legs trembled as he stood, hands still raised. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "If the police ever stop you, baby, you keep your hands visible. You stay calm. You speak clearly and respectfully. Don't move, one officer called out. The crowd parted as they approached, phones still recording every moment. The mother was talking rapidly to the second officer, her voice rising with each word. He could have hurt my baby. He could have taken him. Ma'am, please calm down, the officer said. We need to understand exactly what happened. Rain continued to fall, soaking through Mike's clothes, making him shiver. His backpack lay forgotten on the sidewalk, school books probably ruined. The first officer reached him, expression stern. Turn around, son. Hands behind your back. The cold metal of handcuffs pressed against Mike's wrists. He could hear the crowd murmuring, could feel their stares burning into his skin. You have the right to remain silent, the officer began reciting. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Mike closed his eyes, feeling the rain on his face. In his mind, he saw his grandmother's face when she'd find out about this. Saw the disappointment, the worry, the fear that would cloud her eyes. I'm sorry, Gran, he whispered as the officers led him toward the waiting police car. I'm so sorry. The crowd's phones followed his every move, documenting what was quickly becoming the worst day of his life. Tomorrow, his face would probably be all over social media. The black kid who tried to grab a baby on Park Avenue. As they reached the police car, Mike caught one last glimpse of the baby in his carrier. The infant was sucking his thumb now, peaceful and unaware of the chaos he'd inadvertently caused. The police car's back door opened with a heavy click. Mike ducked his head as the officer helped him inside, mindful not to bump his already injured shoulder. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see the mother holding her baby close, still talking animatedly to the other officer. The security guard was dispersing the crowd, though most people kept their phones trained on the police car. The door slammed shut, muffling the sounds from outside. Mike leaned back against the cold leather seat, his handcuffed hands uncomfortable behind his back. In the front seat, the officer was radioing in, "Dispatch, we have one juvenile male in custody." Responding to attempted kidnapping call at 667 Park Avenue, Mike stared out the window as they pulled away from the curb, watching the Upper East Side blur into a wash of gray rain and neon lights. His shoulder throbbed, his knee stung, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if trying to help had been the biggest mistake of his life. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. Mike sat in a hard plastic chair, his wet clothes sticking uncomfortably to his skin. His wrists were red where the handcuffs had been, though they'd removed them after bringing him inside. Officer Rodriguez sat across from him, a stern-faced woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She hadn't smiled once since they'd arrived. "Full name?" she asked, pen hovering over her notepad. "Michael James Walker. Age? 13. Address?" Mike recited his grandmother's Bronx address, watching as Officer Rodriguez's eyebrows lifted slightly. The reaction was subtle, but he'd seen it before. That tiny shift when people realized he lived in that part of the city. "Parents' names?" Mike's throat tightened. "I live with my grandmother, Margaret Walker. We'll need to contact her," Officer Rodriguez said, reaching for her phone. "Please," Mike leaned forward. "She has heart problems. If you could just let me explain first." The door opened, cutting him off. A tall man in a suit walked in, followed by the mother from the street. She changed into dry clothes, expensive-looking pants, and a blazer that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly rent. "Mrs. Harrison," Officer Rodriguez stood. "Detective Phillips will take your statement now." The woman, Mrs. Harrison, wouldn't look at Mike. She clutched her purse tight against her chest, as if he might try to grab that too. "Where's Jacob?" Mike asked before he could stop himself. "Is he okay?" Mrs. Harrison flinched at his voice. "Don't you dare say my son's name." "Mrs. Harrison." Detective Phillips placed a hand on her shoulder. "Please, let's step into my office." They left, the door closing with a heavy click. Mike slumped in his chair, shoulder throbbing where he'd hit the concrete. "The baby," he said to Officer Rodriguez. "He wasn't hurt, was he? When I caught the carrier? When you grabbed it, you mean?" Her voice was cold. "No." Mike took a deep breath. "The carrier was falling. I was trying to help." She made a note on her pad. And you just happened to be there? On Park Avenue? I was walking to school. I take that route every day. Which school? Roosevelt High. In Manhattan? Another raised eyebrow. Long commute from the Bronx. Better school district, Mike said quietly. My grandmother wanted me to have opportunities. Before Officer Rodriguez could respond, the door opened again. An older black officer stepped in, his badge reading Detective Morris. Rodriguez, I'll take it from here. She gathered her notes and left. Detective Morris sat down, his chair creaking under his weight. He studied Mike for a long moment. You're in a lot of trouble, son. I was trying to help. Mike's voice cracked. The carrier was falling. I just reacted. A baby carrier falls, and you just happen to be right there? Detective Morris leaned forward. That's quite a coincidence. I saw it starting to tip. Mrs. Harrison was on her phone. She didn't notice Dash, so you admit you were watching her? Mike's stomach dropped. No. I mean, yes, but not like that. I was just walking to school. In the Upper East Side? Detective Morris's voice was skeptical. Pretty far from the Bronx. My school's in Manhattan. I've taken that route every day for 2 years. Mike could feel tears burning behind his eyes. You can check with the school. Check with Mr. Chun at the newspaper stand. He sees me every morning. Detective Morris made a note. We'll do that. But right now, we have dozens of witnesses who saw you grab a baby carrier from a woman on the street. We have video of you running toward her. Check the videos. Mike sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. They'll show the carrier falling. They'll show I was helping. Most of the videos start when people heard Mrs. Harrison screaming, Detective Morris said. They show a young man grabbing her baby's carrier and falling to the ground with it. Mike felt the room spinning slightly. All those phones recording, but none of them had caught the whole truth. The door opened again. A uniformed officer stuck his head in. Detective? The grandmother's here. Mike's heart sank. He could hear his grandmother's voice in the hallway, tired but firm. Where is my grandson? I want to see my grandson. Detective Morris stood. Wait here. Mike was alone for a moment, the fluorescent lights still buzzing overhead. His uniform had dried stiff and uncomfortable. His knee stung where the concrete had scraped it raw. The door opened one final time. His grandmother walked in, her face tight with worry. She was still wearing her house dress, a coat hastily thrown over it. Michael! She hurried to him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. Baby, are you hurt? I'm okay, Gran. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mrs. Walker, Detective Morris had returned. Please have a seat. We need to discuss the situation. His grandmother sat beside him, her hand finding his under the table. Her grip was warm and steady, anchoring him. Now, Detective Morris opened his notebook. Your grandson was involved in a serious incident this morning. My Michael's a good boy. His grandmother's voice was firm. Whatever happened, there must be some mistake. Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses who saw him grab a baby carrier from a woman on Park Avenue. Grab? His grandmother's hand tightened on his. Or catch. Detective Morris looked up sharply. Excuse me? My grandson gets up at 5 every morning to go to a better school. He works weekends to help with bills. He's never been in trouble a day in his life. Her voice grew stronger with each word. So I'm asking, did he grab that carrier, or did he catch it? Before the detective could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Through the window in the door, Mike could see people gathering. Someone was shouting. The door burst open. A tall man in an expensive suit stormed in, his face red with anger. Where is he? The man demanded. Where's the boy who tried to take my son? Mrs. Harrison appeared behind him, pulling at his arm. David, please dash, Mr. Harrison. Detective Morris stood. This is an ongoing investigation. Dash. Investigation? Mr. Harrison's voice rose. What's to investigate? He tried to grab my son in broad daylight. Mike's grandmother stood slowly, her arthritis making her movements stiff. But her voice was steel. Your son was falling, she said quietly. My grandson caught him. The room fell silent. Mr. Harrison stared at her, then at Mike, his face still flushed with anger. You expect me to believe Dash, the security cameras, Mike said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. The buildings on Park Avenue. They must have security cameras. They'll show everything. They'll show the truth. Detective Morris exchanged a look with another officer. We've already requested the footage. Then we'll wait, Mike's grandmother said firmly. We'll wait and see what really happened on that street this morning. The fluorescent lights continued their endless buzz as tension filled the room. Mike's future hung in the balance, waiting for the truth to be revealed through the unblinking eyes of security cameras. The interrogation room's clock ticked loudly, marking each endless second. Mike sat with his grandmother, both of them quiet as they waited for the security footage to arrive. His shoulder had stopped throbbing, replaced by a dull, constant ache. Detective Morris returned with 2 paper cups of water. It'll be about another hour. The building security team is pulling the footage now. Mike's grandmother accepted the water with shaking hands. And how long will my grandson have to stay here? That depends on what we see on those tapes, Mrs. Walker. A young officer appeared in the doorway. Detective, you might want to see this. He held up his phone, showing a social media feed. Mike's stomach churned as he caught a glimpse of himself on the screen. Grainy video footage of him being led to the police car in handcuffs. It's going viral, the officer said quietly. Detective Morris cursed under his breath. Keep Mr. and Mrs. Harrison away from any reporters. Last thing we need is them making statements before we have all the facts. The officer nodded and disappeared. Mike's grandmother squeezed his hand. Don't worry about that now, baby. The truth will come out. But Mike couldn't help worrying. He could imagine the comments already. Assumptions made, judgments passed, his whole life reduced to a few seconds of viral video. The door opened again. This time it was Mrs. Harrison, alone. She looked smaller somehow, without her husband's angry presence beside her. She hesitated, not quite meeting Mike's eyes. I wanted to ask something. Detective Morris pulled out a chair for her. Go ahead, Mrs. Harrison. She twisted her hands together. When you grabbed the carrier, was Jacob crying? No, ma'am, Mike said softly. He was quiet. I think he was surprised more than scared. She nodded slowly. He's not usually quiet with strangers. He screams bloody murder at our new nanny. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Mike could feel his grandmother's hand tighten on his. Where is Jacob now? His grandmother asked gently. With his father. At home? Mrs. Harrison's voice cracked slightly. He fell asleep in the car like nothing happened. Before anyone could respond, shouting erupted from the hallway. Those cameras better show the truth. Mr. Harrison's voice boomed. Because if that boy laid one finger on my son with bad intentions, David. Mrs. Harrison stood quickly. Please keep your voice down. She hurried out. Through the door's window, Mike could see her trying to calm her husband, who was red-faced and gesturing wildly. I should check on that, Detective Morris said, standing. Stay here, please. Alone again with his grandmother, Mike finally let his shoulders slump. I messed up, Gran, he whispered. I should have just called out to her or something. Not grabbed the carrier. You did what your heart told you was right, she said firmly. Just like I raised you to do. But look what happened. In your medicine. He glanced at his ruined uniform. I probably lost my job at the paper route, too. How are we going to pay for Michael James Walker? His grandmother's voice was stern. You listen to me. We will manage. We always have. The door opened again. A different officer entered, carrying Mike's backpack in an evidence bag. Your personal effects, he said, setting it down. We'll need to keep the uniform for processing. Mike looked down at the borrowed NYPD sweatshirt they'd given him to wear. It was too big, making him look even younger than his 13 years. His grandmother reached for the backpack. His schoolwork is probably ruined, Mike finished. Everything got soaked in the rain. He could see his math homework through the clear evidence bag, the pages warped and running with ink. His history essay, due today, was completely illegible. The clock continued its relentless ticking. Outside the room, they could hear phones ringing, officers talking, the general bustle of a busy police station. Should we call your school? His grandmother asked. Let them know, They probably already know, Mike said quietly. The video's everywhere by now. As if on cue, his grandmother's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, her face falling as she read the screen. Your principal, she said. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss the incident. Mike closed his eyes. He'd worked so hard to maintain his grades despite the long commute. to prove he deserved his spot at Roosevelt High. Now this one moment might ruin everything. The door opened again. Detective Morris returned, his face unreadable. "The security footage is being transferred now," he said. "Should be ready to view in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Mike's heart started racing again. 20 minutes until everyone would see what really happened on that rain-soaked street. And then, his grandmother asked, "Then we'll know whether to press charges or not." The words hung heavy in the air. Charges. Real criminal charges, not just school discipline or a stern warning. Mike's phone buzzed in the evidence bag. Through the plastic, he could see Mr. Chin's name on the screen. "Can I?" He gestured at the bag. "Can I check my messages?" Detective Morris hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." Mike pulled out his phone with trembling hands. Mr. Chin's message was simple. "I saw what happened. Told the police everything. Stay strong, kid." Fresh tears burned behind his eyes. At least someone else had seen the truth. More commotion erupted from the hallway. This time it was raised voices arguing about press statements and public relations. "The security footage needs to be released immediately," someone was saying. "The public has a right the public has a right to the whole truth," another voice cut in. "Not just viral clips and rumors." Detective Morris stood again. "Excuse me. I need to handle this." The clock kept ticking. Mike's grandmother kept holding his hand. And somewhere in the building, a security video was uploading that would either clear his name or condemn him. "Gran?" Mike's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, baby. I'm scared." She pulled him close, ignoring the uncomfortable chair arms between them. "I know, baby. I know. But we're going to get through this. The truth always comes out in the end." Mike wasn't so sure. He'd seen enough viral videos, enough social media storms, to know that sometimes the truth didn't matter. Sometimes people saw what they wanted to see. The clock ticked on. Each second brought them closer to the moment when everyone would see what really happened that morning on Park Avenue. Mike just prayed it would be enough. The conference room was crowded and tense. Mike sat between his grandmother and Detective Morris, facing a large screen mounted on the wall. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison sat on the opposite side, their lawyer whispering something in Mr. Harrison's ear. "The footage is from 3 different security cameras," Detective Morris explained, remote in hand. "We've synced them to play simultaneously." The screen flickered to life, showing 3 different angles of Park Avenue. The timestamp read 8:42 a.m. The rain was already falling heavily. "There," Mrs. Harrison pointed. "That's when I got out of the car." Mike watched as Mrs. Harrison appeared on screen, juggling her phone and shopping bags. The baby carrier swung from her arm as she paced back and forth on the wet sidewalk. "And there's the suspect," the Harrisons' lawyer noted, pointing at Mike's figure entering the frame. "My grandson," Mike's grandmother corrected firmly. "His name is Michael." On screen, Mike had stopped walking. They could see him standing still, watching as Mrs. Harrison argued on her phone. "See?" Mr. Harrison leaned forward. He was stalking, waiting for his chance dash. "Keep watching," Detective Morris cut in. The next 30 seconds played out in excruciating detail. Mrs. Harrison's shopping bags scattering in the wind, her lunge to catch them, the baby carrier slipping from her grip, beginning its deadly tilt toward the street. Mrs. Harrison's hand flew to her mouth as she watched herself fail to notice her son's danger. On screen, Mike burst into motion. The cameras caught his sprint from 3 different angles, his desperate run through traffic, the way he twisted his body to take the impact as he caught the carrier. "Oh my God," Mrs. Harrison whispered. They watched as the scene continued to unfold. Mike on the ground, protecting the carrier. Mrs. Harrison screams the gathering crowd. The security guard's arrival. "Pause it," Detective Morris said. The screen froze. "Mrs. Harrison, would you like to revise your statements?" Mrs. Harrison was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks again. "He saved him. He saved my baby." Her husband sat frozen, face pale as he stared at the screen. The lawyer was hastily shuffling papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. "Play it again," Mr. Harrison said hoarsely. From the beginning, they watched it 3 more times. Each viewing revealed new details. The way Mike checked traffic before running, how he cradled the carrier to protect it from the impact, the gentle way he held it until Mrs. Harrison took it back. The additional angles came from Bristol Tower and the bank across the street, Detective Morris explained. High-definition security cameras. No room for misinterpretation. Mike's grandmother hadn't said a word. She just held his hand, tears sliding silently down her face. "I want all charges dropped," Mrs. Harrison suddenly announced. Immediately, her husband nodded slowly. "And we'll need to make a public statement. Clear his name." Already trending, Detective Morris held up his phone. Hashtag The Truth and hashtag Hero Kid are taking over social media. The full footage hit the internet 5 minutes ago. Mike felt dizzy. Hero? Just hours ago, he'd been a suspect, a criminal. Now, Michael. Mrs. Harrison stood, walking around the table to face him. "I am so sorry." Her expensive perfume filled his nostrils as she knelt beside his chair. Her eyes were red from crying, but clear and direct now. "You saved my son's life. While I was too busy with my phone to notice he was in danger, you—" Her voice broke. "You risked your own safety to protect him. Anyone would have done the same," Mike mumbled. "No," Mr. Harrison spoke up. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have just watched, or pulled out their phones to record it." Mike's grandmother finally found her voice. "That's not how I raised him." Mrs. Harrison reached into her purse, pulling out a business card. "This is my private number. I'd like to help with your grandson's education. A scholarship, private school dash." Mrs. Harrison, Mike's grandmother, started to protest. "Please," Mrs. Harrison cut in. "Let me do this. Not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. Your grandson showed more character in those few seconds than most people show in a lifetime." The lawyer cleared his throat. "We should discuss the press conference. The media's waiting outside." Mike's stomach dropped. "Press conference? You don't have to speak," Detective Morris assured him. "But the department needs to make a statement. Clear your name officially." "What about school?" Mike asked. "I missed all my classes. My homework got ruined in the rain." A small laugh escaped Mrs. Harrison, the first they'd heard. "I think they'll understand, given the circumstances. I'll drive you both home," Detective Morris offered. "There's a back exit we can use to avoid the reporters." As they gathered their things, Mr. Harrison approached Mike. He seemed smaller now, his earlier anger replaced by shame. "Young man," he said formally, "I judged you wrongly. Made assumptions I never should have made." He extended his hand. "I hope you can forgive me." Mike shook the offered hand, noting how his own darker skin contrasted with Mr. Harrison's pale fingers. Just hours ago, that difference had seemed like an insurmountable barrier. "Now, your son," Mike said. "Jacob, is he really okay?" Mr. Harrison's face softened. "Thanks to you, yes. He's perfect. Probably wondering why his boring old dad is watching him sleep instead of being at work." They made their way out of the conference room. Officers nodded respectfully as Mike passed. The same cops who'd handcuffed him that morning now smiled and called him hero. At the back exit, Mrs. Harrison caught his arm. "Michael, would you come visit Jacob sometime? When things calm down. I'd like him to know the young man who saved him. To learn from your example." Mike looked at his grandmother, who nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I like that." Detective Morris held the door open. "Ready?" Mike stepped out into the afternoon sun. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets clean and glistening. His shoulders still ached, his ruined uniform sat in an evidence bag, and his homework was a lost cause. But he was free. The truth had come out, and maybe, just maybe, something good would come from this terrible day. "Gran," he said as they walked to the detective's car. "Yes, baby. Thank you for raising me right." She squeezed his hand, and together they headed home, leaving the police station and its harsh fluorescent lights behind. The police station's back parking lot was quiet except for their footsteps on wet asphalt. Detective Morris led Mike and his grandmother to an unmarked car, checking carefully for any lingering reporters. "The vultures usually watch the front," he said, opening the back door. "But you can never be too careful." As they pulled out of the lot, Mike caught a glimpse of the media circus at the station's main entrance. TV vans with satellite dishes, reporters with microphones, photographers with long lenses. "Your story's everywhere," Detective Morris said, navigating through side streets. Every major network picked it up. Mike's phone buzzed constantly in his pocket. Messages from classmates, teachers, even kids he barely knew. He turned it off. You'll need to make a statement eventually, the detective continued. But take some time first. Process everything. They drove in silence through the city. The afternoon sun made the wet streets gleam like mirrors. People walked past, umbrellas closed, unaware that their lives hadn't just been turned upside down. Oh! Mrs. Walker suddenly sat up straighter. The pharmacy. Michael's medicine dash, Gran. It's okay, Mike started. No, we need to dash, Mrs. Walker. Detective Morris interrupted gently. I think that won't be a problem anymore. He handed her a business card, the same one Mrs. Harrison had given them. A private number was scrawled on the back. She already called her lawyer, the detective said. They're setting up a trust for Michael's education and your medical expenses. Mike's grandmother stared at the card. Her hands trembled slightly. We can't accept dash, you can, Detective Morris said firmly. And you should. That woman's son is alive because of your grandson. They turned onto their street in the Bronx. Neighbors stood in doorways and on stoops, pointing and whispering as the police car drove past. Great, Mike muttered. More attention. His grandmother squeezed his hand. Hold your head high, baby. You did nothing wrong. They pulled up to their building. Mr. Chin was waiting on the front steps, a newspaper tucked under his arm. Detective, Mike said suddenly. Can you wait a minute? I need to talk to Mr. Chun. The old newsstand owner hurried down the steps as Mike got out of the car. Without a word, he pulled Mike into a tight hug. I knew you were a good kid, Mr. Chin said gruffly. Told those cops right away what I saw. Thank you, Mike whispered. For believing me. Here. Mr. Chun pressed the newspaper into Mike's hands. Tomorrow's early edition. They stopped the presses to change the front page. Mike looked down at the headline. Hero teen saves baby on Park Avenue. Security footage reveals truth behind viral video. Below was a still from the security camera. Mike diving to catch the falling carrier, his body twisting to take the impact. The image was clear, undeniable. Keep it, Mr. Chin said. Something to show your own kids someday. Back in their apartment, Mike's grandmother went straight to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she filled the kettle. Tea, she said. We need tea. Mike sat at the small kitchen table, still clutching the newspaper. The event of the day felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. The kettle whistled. His grandmother poured 2 cups of tea, adding extra sugar to Mike's like she always did when he was upset. Your parents would be proud, she said quietly. Mike's head snapped up. They never talked about his parents. They made their choices, his grandmother continued. But you chose to help someone today. Didn't think about yourself. Didn't hesitate. I was scared, Mike admitted. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. She sat down across from him. It means you do what's right anyway. A knock at the door made them both jump. Detective Morris's voice called through. Mrs. Walker? Sorry to disturb you, but Mrs. Harrison is here. She's alone, no press. Mike's grandmother looked at him questioningly. He nodded. Mrs. Harrison stood in the hallway, looking out of place in her expensive clothes. She carried a large shopping bag. I know this isn't a good time, she said quickly, but I wanted to. She thrust the bag toward Mike. Inside was a new school uniform, crisp white shirts, pressed pants, even a new backpack. For tomorrow, she explained. I called your school. They're expecting you. Everything's been explained. Mrs. Harrison Mike's grandmother started. Margaret, please. Mrs. Harrison's composure cracked slightly. My son is alive because of Michael. Because he was brave enough to act when I was too distracted to notice. She wiped her eyes quickly. The trust is being set up. My husband's lawyer will bring the papers tomorrow. It's not charity. It's the least we can do. Mike looked at the new uniform. The fabric was softer than his old one, the stitching perfect. No tears, no patches, no worn spots. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say you'll come visit Jacob, Mrs. Harrison replied. When things calm down. He should know the kind of person you are. After she left, Mike and his grandmother sat in silence. The new uniform spread out on the kitchen table. Things are going to change, his grandmother finally said. Mike nodded. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. Probably more messages, more reactions to the video, more people wanting to know his story. But we'll face it together, she continued. Like we always have. The afternoon sun slanted through their small kitchen window, catching the steam from their cooling tea. Outside, they could hear neighbors talking, cars passing, the normal sounds of their neighborhood. But nothing felt normal anymore. In just one day, one moment, everything had shifted. "Gran?" Mike said softly. "Yes, baby? I'm glad it was me. Who was there this morning? I'm glad I could help." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her palm was warm from holding her teacup. "That's because you have a good heart, Michael James Walker. And today, the whole world got to see it." They sat together as the sun set, drinking tea, looking at the newspaper with its bold headline. Tomorrow would bring reporters, lawyers, changes they couldn't even imagine yet. But for now, they had this moment. The truth was out. And sometimes, Mike realized the truth was better than any story anyone could make up. The next morning felt strange. Mike stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his new uniform shirt. The fabric felt stiff, unfamiliar against his skin. "Michael," his grandmother called from the kitchen. "Your breakfast is getting cold." He found her at the stove, making eggs despite the pile of papers spread across their small table. Legal documents from the Harrisons, lawyers sat next to college savings forms and medical insurance paperwork. "Eat," she said, sliding a plate in front of him. "You got a big day." A knock at the door made them both pause. Detective Morris stood outside, still in his uniform. "Thought you might want to ride to school," he said. "There's still some media hanging around." Mike looked at his grandmother. She nodded. "Let me get my backpack." The new backpack felt wrong too. Too clean, too perfect. He'd had his old one since 6th grade, knew every tear and patch. They drove through morning traffic, taking side streets to avoid the news vans that still lingered in their neighborhood. "How's the shoulder?" Detective Morris asked. Mike rotated it carefully. "Better. Still sore." "You're lucky. Could have been worse, hitting the concrete like that." They passed Mr. Chin's newsstand. The old man waved, pointing to the stack of papers with Mike's picture still on the front. "Your story's going national," Detective Morris said. "Morning shows want interviews. Magazine writers calling the station." Mike stared out the window. "I just want things to go back to normal." The detective glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Sometimes normal isn't what it used to be, son." They turned onto Park Avenue. Mike's stomach tightened as they approached the spot where everything had happened. "We can go another way," Detective Morris offered. "No," Mike said quietly. "I can't avoid it forever." They drove past the exact spot. The concrete still showed dark patches from yesterday's rain. A few bouquets of flowers lay on the sidewalk. "People started leaving them last night," the detective explained. "After the footage went viral. Roosevelt High looked different somehow, though nothing had actually changed." Students stopped and stared as the police car pulled up to the entrance. "You sure you're ready for this?" Mike took a deep breath. "No, but I'm going anyway." The main office was waiting for him. Principal Matthews stood in the doorway. Her usually stern face softened with concern. "Michael," she said warmly, "come in. We have some things to discuss." The Harrisons' lawyer sat inside, along with a woman Mike didn't recognize. "This is Ms. Rodriguez from the school board," Principal Matthews explained. "She's here to discuss your transfer options." Mike's head snapped up. "Transfer?" "To Riverside Prep," the lawyer said smoothly. "The Harrisons' alma mater. They've offered you a full scholarship. Riverside Prep, the most expensive private school in Manhattan." Mike had walked past its ivy-covered walls countless times, never imagining he'd step inside. But he looked at Principal Matthews. "I like it here, and we'd love to keep you," she said. "But this is an incredible opportunity, Michael." They talked for an hour. About academic programs, about college preparation, about opportunities Mike had never dared to dream about. "You don't have to decide today," Ms. Rodriguez said. "Take some time. Think it over." The morning passed in a blur. In every class, teachers smiled at him with new respect. Students who'd never spoken to him suddenly wanted to be his friend. At lunch, he sat alone at his usual table. But not for long. "Hey," a girl from his math class, Sarah, set her tray down. "Mind if I join you?" Before he could answer, others came too. Soon the table was full of people asking questions, offering congratulations, wanting to know how it felt to be a hero. "I'm not," he kept saying. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Sarah said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have risked themselves like that." After school, Detective Morris was waiting again. "One more stop," he said as Mike got in. "If you're up for it." They drove to an upscale neighborhood. Mike's heart rate picked up as they pulled into a familiar driveway. Mrs. Harrison opened the door before they could knock. She looked different in casual clothes, more human somehow. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Someone's been asking for you." The nursery was painted pale blue. Toys scattered the floor. And there, in a rocking chair, Mr. Harrison held his son. "Jacob," he said, standing. "This is Michael, the young man who helped you yesterday." The baby looked at Mike with wide, curious eyes. No fear, no judgment, just pure innocence. "Would you like to hold him?" Mrs. Harrison asked. Mike hesitated. "I've never—" "Here." She took Jacob from her husband. "Support his head. Like this." The baby felt impossibly small in Mike's arms. Jacob reached up, grabbing Mike's finger with surprising strength. "He likes you," Mrs. Harrison said, smiling through tears. "Have you thought about Riverside?" Mr. Harrison asked. Mike looked down at the baby in his arms, at this tiny life he'd helped save. "I have," he said slowly. But Roosevelt High gave me a chance when no one else would. Let me commute from the Bronx. Believed in me." Mr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Loyalty. That's rare these days." "The scholarship offer stands," Mrs. Harrison said. "Whatever you decide." Jacob had fallen asleep, still clutching Mike's finger. "He'll never remember yesterday," Mrs. Harrison said softly. "But we'll tell him, when he's older, about the boy who didn't hesitate, who did the right thing when it mattered most." Later, driving home, Mike was quiet. "Tough decision?" Detective Morris asked. "Yeah, you'll make the right choice. You've got good instincts." They pulled up to Mike's building. Mr. Chun was closing his stand for the day. "One more thing," Detective Morris said, reaching into his pocket. "The department wanted you to have this." It was a certificate of commendation. Mike's name in fancy script, words like bravery and service to the community. "Thank you," Mike said, his throat tight. "No, son. Thank you for reminding us what a hero really looks like." Mike climbed the stairs to his apartment slowly, certificate in hand. His grandmother was waiting. "Good day?" she asked. He showed her the certificate, told her about Jacob, about Riverside Prep. "What do you think I should do, Gran?" She studied him for a long moment. "I think you already know." And maybe he did. Maybe some choices weren't really choices at all, but just stepping stones on a path that was already laid out. He looked out their small kitchen window at the setting sun. Tomorrow would bring more decisions, more changes, more challenges. But for now, he had this moment, this certainty that he'd done the right thing, not just yesterday on Park Avenue, but every day since, by staying true to who he was. A month had passed since that rainy morning on Park Avenue. Mike stood outside Roosevelt High, adjusting his new uniform one last time. Students streamed past, calling out greetings. He wasn't invisible anymore. "Ready for your last day?" Principal Matthews asked, approaching from the parking lot. "Yes, ma'am." Mike smiled. "And thank you for everything." She squeezed his shoulder, the one that had finally stopped aching. "We'll miss you, Michael, but Riverside Prep is lucky to have you." The decision had come after a week of thinking, of talking with his grandmother, of looking deep inside himself. Roosevelt High had given him his first chance. Riverside Prep would give him his next one. "Michael!" Sarah jogged up, her math textbook clutched to her chest. "You're still coming to study group tonight, right? Just because you're abandoning us for some fancy private school doesn't mean you can skip your tutoring duties." He laughed. After the incident, he discovered he had a knack for explaining math to others. The study group had started small, just Sarah and a few others. Now it filled the library every Tuesday and Thursday. "I'll be there," he promised. "And it's not abandonment. I'll still come back to help." His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Harrison. Jacob rolled over by himself today. Had to share with his hero. "Coffee this weekend?" The Harrisons had become a regular part of his life. Weekend visits. Family dinners. Jacob's face lighting up every time Mike walked into the room. "Still hard to believe," Sarah said, reading the text over his shoulder. "You went from being just another kid in class to having billionaires on speed dial." "They're not billionaires," Mike corrected. "And they're just regular people." The first bell rang. Students hurried inside, but Mike lingered for a moment, looking at the building that had been his second home for 2 years. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his grandmother. Medicine picked up. New insurance is amazing. Love you, baby. The trust fund the Harrisons had set up covered everything now. His grandmother's medical bills, their rent, even a college savings account. But they still lived in their small Bronx apartment. Some things didn't need to change. Mr. Walker, his history teacher, Mr. Peterson, stuck his head out the door. Planning to join us for your last day? Inside, his classroom looked different. The worn desks, the flickering fluorescent lights. Everything seemed softer somehow, bathed in memory. Before we start, Mr. Peterson said, I think we all owe Michael a proper send-off. The class erupted in applause. Mike felt his face grow hot. Speech, someone called out. Mike stood slowly. I want to thank you all for treating me the same after everything happened, for not making me feel different. But you were different, Sarah said from her seat. You always were. We just didn't see it before. The day passed too quickly. Each class felt like saying goodbye to a piece of himself. But not goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. After school, Mr. Chen was waiting outside with his newsstand. Last day, kid? He asked, though he already knew. Yeah. Mike accepted the apple the old man held out. Some traditions didn't change. You did good, Mr. Chen said gruffly. Your story's still selling papers. People need to hear about good things sometimes. Detective Morris pulled up in his unmarked car. Another new tradition. He'd driven Mike to and from school every day since the incident, claiming it was on his way. Big day tomorrow, the detective said as Mike got in. Yeah. Mike watched Roosevelt High disappear in the side mirror. Big day. They drove past the spot on Park Avenue. The flowers were gone now, but Mike still felt a flutter in his stomach every time they passed it. Heard from Columbia University yesterday, Detective Morris mentioned casually. They want to talk to you about their future scholars program. Mike stared at him. I'm only 13. Never too early to plan ahead. The detective grinned. Hero kids get special consideration. I'm not a hero. Yeah. Tell that to Jacob. They pulled up to Mike's building. His grandmother stood outside with Mrs. Harrison and Jacob. Surprise! Mrs. Harrison called out. Someone wanted to wish you luck for tomorrow. Jacob squealed and reached for Mike as soon as he got close. At 10 months old, he was already trying to walk. He took 3 steps this morning, Mrs. Harrison said proudly. David recorded it. Want to see? They gathered in Mike's small kitchen. His grandmother made tea while Mrs. Harrison pulled up the video on her phone. Jacob's chubby legs wobbled as he took his first uncertain steps. He's growing so fast, Mike said. Thanks to you. Mrs. Harrison touched his arm. He's growing it all thanks to you. Later, after they left, Mike packed his old Roosevelt High uniform into a box. His grandmother watched from the doorway. Having second thoughts? She asked. No. Mike folded the worn shirt carefully. Just remembering, sometimes the best way to honor old memories is to make new ones. She held out an envelope. Inside was a card from his study group, signed by everyone. They dropped it off earlier, she said. Wanted you to have it for tomorrow. Mike read each message, smiling at the inside jokes, the good wishes, the promises to stay in touch. Gran, he said finally. Yes, baby. I'm not leaving Roosevelt behind. Am I? By going to Riverside? She sat on his bed, patting the space beside her. You're taking the best parts of Roosevelt with you. The determination, the gratitude, the understanding of what it means to work hard for something. And you'll still be tutoring there twice a week, she added. Principal Matthews already set up the program. Mike looked around his small room. His new Riverside Prep uniform hung on the closet door, crisp and ready for tomorrow. His old backpack sat next to the new one. He decided to keep using it, despite Mrs. Harrison's protests. Some changes you chose. Others chose you. The trick was knowing which was which, and making the best of both. His phone buzzed one last time. A text from Mr. Harrison. David here. Board meeting tomorrow, but wanted to say, Riverside's lucky to have you. Give him hell, kid. Mike smiled. Tomorrow he'd walk through Riverside Prep's gates, wearing a new uniform, carrying his old backpack, being both the person he was and the person he was becoming. Ready for bed? His grandmother asked. Big day tomorrow. Yeah. Mike hugged her tight. Love you, Gran. Love you too, baby. She kissed his forehead. Always have, always will. Later, lying in bed, Mike thought about choices and chances, about rainy mornings and falling babies, about how one moment could change everything, but only if you let it change you in the right ways. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces, new opportunities, but he was ready, because some things didn't change. His grandmother's love, his determination, his belief in doing what was right. And some changes weren't really changes at all, but just new ways of being who you always were. Mike Walker closed his eyes, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Hero or not, he knew who he was. And sometimes, that was the biggest victory of all.